Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. Today we're doing a stir fry called a broccoli beef stir fry. Which, if you're here in the States, is probably a stir fry that you have come across at least once. I would be really surprised unless you really don't like Chinese food if you've never come across a broccoli beef stir fry, because it's just a really common and just like a very, very basic and fundamental stir fry that you will come across in most Chinese American cuisine. Today we're going to be taking a shot at doing this with a couple of particular techniques that are particularly two of my very, very favorite things to do. First off with Angus steak, or actually we're using flank steak today finally. And second off with the use of a couple of extra heat elements that we're going to incorporate to kind of kick things up a notch a little bit, as Emeril Lagasse would say. If you have any questions for me, feel free and drop your questions in the chat. As always, I don't know everything about broccoli beef stir fries, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least fun to watch. This particular version of broccoli beef that we're doing is based off of a recipe that I released over on the YouTube channel. That was back last Friday, so almost a whole week ago now. Those come out every Friday, so if you haven't found your way over to the YouTube channel yet, I definitely recommend bopping over that way and checking out what's going on over there. We've got new recipes coming out every Friday, so this coming Friday and tomorrow is going to be a recipe for a sweet and sour chicken, which is one of my favorites. One of my more recent favorites, not something that I have always been in the habit of eating, but mostly because I just generally I'm not a huge fan of like super sweet Chinese food. But I actually thought it came out really, really great, and is a really good example of how to fry chicken for Chinese food. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things today. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. Always more fun to talk about all of the things that everyone else has problems with, instead of just stuff that I mess up, which is a lot of things. I mess stuff up all the time. Let's see. As with pretty much every stir fry, so again, I'll also mention that one of my favorite parts about this particular stir fry is that it runs through a bunch of the really, really fundamental things that are really, really important to stir frying. Number one is batch cooking, which you absolutely have to do unless you're cooking in a commercial kitchen or on a wok burner. You have to batch cook this dish because it includes broccoli, which is a very, very sturdy vegetable. It also runs through some of the very, very, very basic fundamentals behind how to cook vegetables in a wok, which is particularly tricky because we're essentially going to be undercooking them, which is interesting, and also part of what makes wok fried veggies so iconic and like particular to veggies that are cooked in a wok. So we're going to talk about all that stuff today, so if you have any questions, hit me in the chat. As with pretty much every stir fry that we cook, I'm starting off that was 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, and next up this is going to be about an inch or about 1 tablespoon of finely minced ginger. You don't have to peel your ginger, especially if it's super fresh. I actually have gotten in the habit of not peeling my ginger when it's really fresh. And you can always tell when your ginger is super fresh because it's very, very moist. It kind of looks like it just came out of the ground, probably because it did just come out of the ground. So when it's super fresh, you absolutely don't have to peel that stuff because it's got a very, very thin texture to it, which is going to be relatively easy to chew on and not particularly chewy or difficult to bite into. As it gets older, though, I have found that once ginger passes maybe like a day or two old, what happens is it starts drying out. And the ginger itself is not drying out, it's just the exterior skin of that ginger is drying out, which is a little bit rough and chewy. So we like to peel that stuff off so that we don't end up chewing on it, which is kind of gross. So this particular ginger that we're using, I think is almost a whole month old. It's really old ginger. And it's still fine, it's not molding or anything, but it is a little bit chewy on the exterior, so I used a spoon and we kind of peeled that stuff off to make sure that we're not chewing on really chewy broccoli, which is gross. Ginger, not broccoli. Okay, so next up is our steak, which we're finally back into using flank steak today. If you've been following these streams over the last couple of weeks, you will have noticed that I have not been able to get my hands on flank steak for a long time. I don't know why. Just something about the grocery store that I shop at, for whatever reason, it just has not had flank steak for a super, super long time. So what we want to pay attention to anytime that you're using flank steak, especially flank steak, because it's very, very apparent, is when we chop flank steak, it's got to be chopped against the grain. So the more that you chop with the grain, the chewier that stuff is going to become. So if you could take a look. If you look super close with our super close lens, you can actually see the direction of the grain. It's really, really apparent in a flank steak. It's all going this direction. You can see it here too. So which means that we want to be cutting in this direction downward as much as we possibly can. So that's going to help us keep our steak super chewy, super tender. So obviously, because of the way that this piece of steak is shaped, we're eventually going to have to cut with the grain. So I'm going to do one chop with the grain. But the rest of our chops here are going to be against the grain, and that's going to get us this very, very nice tender piece of steak. We should start keeping a tally of how many days without flank steak. Yeah, I want to say I have not been able to find flank steak since I think like April or May. And then I want to say we probably have had flank steak maybe in like some of the streams in June, in May, but that was coming out of the ice box from the last time that I have found flank steak. And I have a feeling, so I have a suspicion that the reason that I have not been able to find flank steak, because when I asked about it, the guy gave me a very, very weird look, and I don't think he was actually a butcher. And he said, "What's flank steak?" Which is just like, what? So maybe I just need to go to a better butcher. I don't know. Who knows? So anyway, so with our flank steak, what I'm going to do is, so I'm chopping against the grain here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a technique that comes up in a lot of Chinese food that we call velveting, which is essentially coating our flank steak in baking soda. So it's not something that I have made a big habit out of doing, mostly because it takes a little bit longer. So we're going to have to take an extra... I don't know, like an extra... Technically, if you're really paying attention, you should spend at least an extra half an hour getting that velveting in. We're not going to take an extra half an hour, but that's probably the main reason why I have avoided doing the velveting technique. But what I have found is, since I have started experimenting with velveting my steaks, it has created a much more tender piece of steak. So what's going to happen is, and disclaimer is that I am not a food scientist. I don't know any of the science behind this stuff, but from what I have read, what it is essentially doing is that baking soda is preventing a lot of the proteins that are going on in that steak from bonding together when we sear it. So what will happen is when we add that, when we coat it and soak it in baking soda for a little while, about 30 minutes, it's going to prevent that steak from bonding as much. And it's going to give us a much more tender piece of steak. So that tends to be particularly useful with cuts of steak like flank or Angus or anything that's really, really lean, because all of those cuts are already pretty chewy as they are already. So that helps kind of cut the chewiness of that steak down by a bit. Which is really useful. So the part that's particularly useful, we do that with flank steak a lot, because flank steak is a really, really cheap cut of steak already. So. All right. There it is. Sorry for loud noises. All right. So this is our flank steak. I've chopped it up pretty thinly against the grain. We're going to set this aside. And then in a separate bowl, I suppose we should clean the cutting board. All right, now, in a separate bowl, we're going to combine, this is going to be a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda with a 1/4 cup of water. So the goal here right now is mainly just like we do with a cornstarch slurry, is we're trying to keep our baking soda from clumping up. I know I have seen a lot of recipes call for just adding that baking soda straight to the marinade, and you can totally just drop it in. I'm not particularly a huge fan of the way that that's done, mainly because any baker who has ever worked with soda will tell you the same thing. Baking soda, when it remains unactivated. So if you've ever used baking soda in a recipe and you added a little bit too much to it, so like say if you're making bread, or probably not bread, but like a cake, and you add the wrong quantity of baking soda, what will happen is that extra baking soda, it's going to go unactivated in your recipe, and then you're going to essentially be eating raw baking soda. And raw baking soda has a flavor to it, so you don't want to just be eating raw baking soda. It tastes kind of metallic. If you're curious, just take a little bit of baking soda and put it in your mouth, taste it. And it kind of has this like really bright metallic-y taste to it, which we don't want. We don't want any of that to be left behind. So the real trick here behind our velveting technique is being able to make sure that once we're done using this baking soda for our velvet, is that we can also remove it afterwards. So what we're doing here, so I just added that to our steak, and then we're going to let that coat and sit for, this will probably go, yeah, this might go for about 20-30 minutes. We're going to let this sit for about 30 minutes, but the real trick here is that we want to also be able to drain off that baking soda when we're done too. So that's going to be really, really important. If you don't remember to drain off that remaining baking soda that's left behind, you're going to start tasting that baking soda, which is not super great. So it takes a little bit of an extra step, but I guarantee you, and I don't say this about a lot of things, but this particular technique of velveting, it has led to some of the most tender pieces of steak that I have ever done. And if I didn't know better, I would have thought that I was biting into a much more expensive piece of steak because of this technique, which I thought was really, really cool. So to save time, I'm also just going to drop my marinade in here, and then we're going to pour it out when we're done. This is going to be, that's 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. Followed next by a single tablespoon of brown sugar. Then next up, this is going to be 1/2 teaspoon of white pepper. And finally, also a 1/2 teaspoon of cornstarch. The cornstarch, as always, you'll see that come up in most of my marinades, especially meat marinades. It's going to prevent the steak from overcooking as we sear it. So it's going to coat the exterior of our steak, just like we do with chicken or ground beef or really any kind of meat that goes into a wok. It's going to coat that exterior of the steak so that while we cook it, the first thing that cooks is actually the cornstarch. So it slows down the exterior cook just long enough so that the interior of our steak can catch up a little bit, which tends to be really, really useful in wok cooking because we're cooking at such high heat that without that extra maybe like 30-45 seconds, things will start overcooking pretty quickly. So that's our steak. We're going to let this marinate. It will probably go for like maybe 15 minutes, which would be good enough. We're going to let this marinate for as long as possible. What I do usually tell people is this should go for 30 minutes or up to an hour. I don't think, not since I did this recipe, or wrote this recipe, I don't think I've let it actually marinate for a full 30 minutes. Usually we're probably going to let it go for, we could time it, probably go for like maybe 10 minutes and we'll see what happens. But what we are going to do though, so all of this liquid marinade that's living at the bottom of this bowl, we're going to dump that out and then pour all of that baking soda that's residual out from our marinade so that we don't end up eating that leftover baking soda. Acrobatic Bike, how's it going? Yeah. Did I say brown sugar or ground sugar? I don't know what ground sugar would be. That was light brown sugar. So I have been in the habit of using light brown sugar. Almost pretty much any time that you see me using sugar, it's light brown sugar. Mostly, so there's a couple of reasons. So the reason that I don't tend towards white sugar is I find that it's a little bit more like aggressively sweet and like very, very like almost like sickly sweet. It kind of reminds me of like candy. It's almost like you're seasoning your meat with candy. Which to me is a little bit off-putting. So I have gotten in the habit of using brown sugar because it's got a little bit more of a molasses sweetness. Obviously, if you're not familiar, brown sugar is made from molasses, so that's the reason that it's brown. It's because it's made from molasses. So it's got a little bit more of like an interesting sweetness to it. So if you're just looking for a really easy sweet thing to throw into your marinade to kind of like help that caramelization cook along, brown sugar is really, really useful. If you don't have brown sugar, you could also just use white sugar and it'll be just fine. I also have started to tend away from dark brown sugar because I find that it's a little bit more aggressive than I'd like it to be. But good question, yeah. I don't know what ground sugar. I guess ground sugar maybe like a palm sugar. That might be ground. Yeah, cool. So next up, this is going to be our sauce. This is going to be 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. Followed by, so this is probably the same 3 ingredients that you will see me use in a lot of recipes. Pretty much any time that you see me using dark soy sauce, I'm going to use the same 3 things. So it's going to be, this is oyster sauce, this is dark or black vinegar, and then this is dark soy sauce. So lots of people ask me about like pantry ingredients to sort of build out as you kind of like build a pantry of stuff for Asian cooking. If you're trying to experiment with dark soy sauce, which is this one, these are probably the big 3 to get your hands on because they work hand in hand really, really well. As we sort of like build out colors of like caramel coloring and like dark brown umami, that comes from the use of all 3 of these. So dark soy sauce, black vinegar, and oyster sauce. You will see me using those 3 things in tangent all the time. So it happens that happened in the Mongolian beef. We used it in the pad ki mao recipe that we did 2 days ago. You used it in the pad see ew recipe. We used it in our lion's head meatballs. Pretty much anything that has dark soy sauce, and I'll probably use all 3 of these. So this is going to be 2 tablespoons each of dark soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of black vinegar. And again, if you don't have black vinegar, you could also sub it with rice vinegar. Pretty much the same thing. Black vinegar has a little bit more of a molassesy sweetness to it. So again, also contributing to that color. And finally, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce. This might end up being 1 tablespoon because we don't have enough. Let's see. There we go. So those are going to be the big 3 ingredients that we're adding here to kick off all of that really, really dark caramel coloring. Hey, there's ham charo. Yeah, granulated sugar. I guess that would be what ground sugar is. So next up, this is going to be our, by the way, that's ham charo. Ham charo is the hamster that eats ramen. Ham charo only gets to eat ramen when somebody feeds him. So if you want to feed ham charo, please hop over to the YouTube and subscribe. Next up, this is going to be our 2 spice elements. So this is going to be a single tablespoon of doubanjiang. Doubanjiang is a very, very aggressive form of chili paste. So it is very, very forward. And if you use too much of it, it absolutely can take over a recipe. So we're only using a single tablespoon of it. But if you like really, really spicy stuff, yeah, you could absolutely use a couple tablespoons of it. And it would be super spicy. Then next up, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of chili crisp oil, or lao gan ma. If you're not familiar with lao gan ma, it is essentially, I want to say like red chili flakes that are fermented or slow cooked at a very, very low heat in oil, and then fermented for a while. And then what it ends up results in is this very, very mellow form of heat that is very, very pervasive. It kind of just spreads throughout a dish really, really well. because it's soaked in that oil. So the oil is kind of going throughout the whole dish really, really well. So if you've never experimented with lau gan ma, you can use quite a bit of it because it's not terribly aggressive. It's not going to be overwhelmingly hot, but it is going to be like very pervasive. It's going to get throughout the whole dish, whereas like lots of times with say like doubanjiang, you have to mix it in really, really well. Otherwise it kind of just like sits. Tandem, yeah. Cool. So this is our sauce. As always, I always recommend season to taste. This is already quite salty already, so I don't think we're gonna add anything to it. But super often you will see me adding a pinch of salt to most of my sauces. The reason that comes up quite a bit is because I'm using low sodium soy sauce, which has a little bit less salt in it than it should. And I kind of like that. That's actually the reason why I work with low sodium soy sauce so much, is because we can course correct a little bit easier in case we need to. Next up, this is going to be our cornstarch slurry. So as the name implies, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of cornstarch that's going to be dissolved in a little bit of water. There's nothing particularly special about the quantity of water. What we're mainly looking to do is dissolve this cornstarch so that it is not in a solid form. This is also something that you will see come up in probably most Chinese stir fries because it's going to be how we create a thick and cohesive sauce. Without